Good day. The reports from the Middle East over the last few hours, or at least and specifically from the Israel-Palestine Gaza front, suggest that Israeli troops are still located inside the Gaza Strip, but that they have not made any serious attempt to advance into Gaza City itself, and that there has been little so far in the way of hand-to-hand fighting or attempts by Israeli troops to clear Palestinian fighters, Hamas fighters, from the positions that they are occupying. Now, there's lots of reports, lots of claims about what exactly has been happening, who is getting the upper hand in the fighting, things of that sort. Given the complete lack of independent information about any of this, I'm not going to get or try to get into the details of this. I don't think anybody outside the political leaderships of Israel and Hamas and of their respective allies knows the exact situation. And I suspect that in each case, neither will want to give a fully accurate idea of what is taking place. However, I think a number of general points can be made. Firstly, it is looking increasingly as if Israel has decided to drop the idea of an all-out ground offensive to try to clear Hamas out of Gaza. There's been a report to that effect in the New York Times, and I suspect it is true. The idea is, and supposedly this has been the advice that Israel has been receiving from the United States, the idea supposedly is to carry out incremental strikes over a very long period of time, several weeks, several months, gradually closing off lines of retreat for Hamas, hitting targets in their bunkers and tunnels and those sort of things. And eventually, the idea is to suffocate Hamas into total collapse and eventually some sort of a breakdown. And this doesn't seem to be fleshed out in great detail, but the latest comments from Prime Minister Netanyahu do seem to confirm that this is the drift of decision-making that the Israelis are moving towards. Of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu said some weeks ago that this would be a long war, and it does seem that a long war is indeed what we are likely to get. And I've had some really very interesting explanations of what the Israeli and, by the way, American tactics with respect to Gaza are going to be. It's been suggested that the Israelis will carry out raids, striking individual Hamas targets, seeking to free hostages. The number of hostages that the Israelis claim that Hamas has under its control has now increased to, I believe, 230. I remember seeing reports about a week ago that it was 150, but it seems that the number is actually greater than that. Hamas, incidentally, is claiming that 50 hostages have already been killed in Israeli airstrikes, but there seems to be little in the way of detail that I've seen about this. And for the moment, at least, I'm going to note that, but park it to one side. I don't know whether this information is correct. This information which is coming from Hamas is correct. But anyway, raids into Hamas-controlled territory, presumably by Israeli special forces, trying to free hostages, target Hamas leaders, break down Hamas's communications, gradually tightening the circle around Hamas, destroying its tunnel and bunker network with heavy bombs. And the idea is that eventually, over time, the whole Hamas structure will be destroyed, will be broken. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is now talking in a very similar way, and this is a point that several people have pointed out to me. He's talking about Gaza now in ways that do bear some resemblance to the political objectives that President Putin set out when he ordered the special military operation to take place in Ukraine. So Prime Minister Netanyahu is talking about ending Hamas, in effect cleansing Gaza completely of Hamas, just as President Putin spoke about the demilitarization of Ukraine, similar comments coming from Israel about Gaza, and the purging from Ukraine, cleansing of Ukraine of the ideology from the 1930s that has gained hold there. Well, Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu is speaking in similar ways about Gaza. And again, Israeli officials continue to insist that people in northern Gaza quit, that they leave northern Gaza, and they are also simultaneously giving reassurances that when this military operation is concluded, the people of Gaza, the residents of northern Gaza, will be allowed to return. Though what condition they will find northern Gaza in, should that happen, well, I can't really even begin to imagine. And again, I've seen several people say that the tactics that the Israelis are going to be following in Gaza are similar in some respects to the tactics that the Russians followed in Bakhmut, that General Surovikin conducted in Bakhmut with the assistance of the Wagner forces, and that eventually, ultimately, the Israeli objectives will be realized in Gaza, just as the Russian objectives were eventually realized in Bakhmut. I'm going to say straight away that I think that there are many, many problems with this approach, if it is indeed the approach that Israel is going to follow. Firstly, let me repeat once again a point which I have already made in the past, which is that, of course, if we're talking about comparisons between Gaza and Bakhmut, there are no comparisons. Bakhmut was a relatively small place, 70,000 people, before the current fighting in Ukraine began in 2022. Gaza is a densely populated city of over 2 million people. Some people say as many as 2.3 million people live there. That is the first thing to say. The second is that when the fighting in Bakhmut actually began, when the fighting started in November last year, the civilian population had already left Bakhmut. Bakhmut was largely deserted. There were a few people still there, but we're talking about a city that had been turned into a kind of fortress by the Ukrainian army, but which was empty of its residents. Again, that is not the situation in Gaza at the present time. Thirdly, Bakhmut was never fully surrounded by the Russians. Now, there was a time when it did seem as if the Russians were intending to surround Bakhmut, but eventually, for various reasons which have never been entirely explained, they decided that they would not do so. I've heard informally that, again, this has been people who have been writing to me, that the reason that the final encirclement of Bakhmut never happened was in part because, again, Prigozhin and decided that rather than seek an encirclement, which would take time, he would press forward with an advance in Bakhmut itself and would capture the city by essentially a town, by an assault, and that this complicated decision-making further and prevented the encirclement of Bakhmut happening because Prigozhin concentrated Wagner's resources on the town itself rather than in the encirclement operations that some in the Russian military thought he should have followed. I'm going to be very careful about this. It could very well be that this is simply critics of Prigozhin within the Russian Defense Ministry, once again casting doubt on his ideas, his approach to the battle in Bakhmut. But anyway, so there is that difference. The Russians never fully encircled Bakhmut. The Israelis have, in effect, already encircled Gaza. They control all the access points into Gaza, and by the way, have always done so. They control the airspace over Gaza. They control ports, the port facilities. This means that Gaza is, to a great extent, physically isolated from the rest of the world, to an extent that Bakhmut actually never was. And one can see that this can work in Israel's favor in the sense that it's impossible for the Hamas forces in Gaza to achieve much in the way of reinforcement and supplies from outside. Perhaps some things could be smuggled in, but probably not very much. But of course, it also creates a whole set of problems for Israel as well, in that this blockade of Gaza, the cutting off of water and food and energy supplies into Gaza, is now coming in for intense criticism from the global community. It's been criticized at the United Nations. It's been criticized by the UN Secretary General and by the UN Secretariat. It has been criticized by various humanitarian agencies, including, by the way, Amnesty International and others. And of course, all of this comes to the fundamental underlying difference between the situation in Bakhmut and the situation in Gaza. Bakhmut was one battle within the context of a larger war. You were never going to see protests around the world happening because of what was going on in Bakhmut. It was just one battle. Whereas Gaza is completely different. Gaza is a densely populated Arab Palestinian city under siege by Israel. And of course, what that inevitably means is that there are going to be massive protests about this siege across the Arab and Muslim world. And by the way, I have noticed increasingly in Europe as well, including, by the way, in Britain. And it is the political clock that is the most difficult one, the one that makes the fundamental difference between the two wars. Briefly, Russia, despite all of the attempts that the West has made, has not been isolated politically, diplomatically, economically over the course of this conflict in Ukraine. It continues to have friends and allies right across the world. Its economy has been surging. Its production rates have been surging. It is not the target of protests over what happens in a place like Bakhmut or Avadiivka or any other such place. This is simply not the same situation at all with what is going on in Gaza. These protests that we're seeing, these moves that we have been seeing in the General Assembly, which are certain to be followed up by further applications, further proposals for resolutions to the Security Council, to the General Assembly. That is all going to intensify, and whereas the Russians have all the time that they need to do whatever it is that they intend to do in Ukraine, the same is not the case with Israel in Gaza. This operation is politically and time limited. And there will come a point, despite the solidity of US support up to now for Israel in the United States, there will come a point where it is impossible for the United States to sustain that support, especially if more of its European allies peel away, as France already did over the course of that vote in the General Assembly that I discussed yesterday. So there are fundamental differences and fundamental problems. If Israel had an unlimited amount of time, it would be able to defeat Hamas in Gaza. There might be horrendous civilian casualties. There might be tens of thousands of people killed. But if it was simply a case of a simple battlefield, Israel obviously has the enormous preponderance of military advantage. But war, as has been discussed many times, as Clausewitz once famously said, war is an aspect of politics, and it is the political clock that is now ticking, and which, by the way, in my opinion, is already dictating some of the major actions, some of the major moves that various people are taking in the Middle East. The American build-up that we see there, all of those things. So, there we are. That's where we are at the moment. Continued fighting between Hamas and Israel, continued missile attacks by Hamas against targets in Israel, increasing warnings from Iran and Hezbollah perhaps edging towards slowly increasing the amount of military action it is taking in the north of Israel, and the overwhelming likelihood that before long there will be more political pressure in the General Assembly, in other places, for a ceasefire, which, to be very clear, if it is seen that that ceasefire has been imposed on Israel and on the United States by the outside world, if Hamas is still standing at the conclusion of this operation, then there will be a universal perception across the Middle East and the larger Islamic world, and indeed the global south, that Hamas has achieved a certain victory in this confrontation, and that it will be Israel that will be the loser, and this, of course, will be compounded even further if there is some kind of cataclysmic conflict between the United States and Iran, which, as I fear might happen, ends up unsuccessful for the United States and by extension for Israel. So I don't think that this is a strategy that is going to succeed. If Israel is going to pursue a successful strategy in Gaza, a successful military strategy in Gaza, then it is short of time. And I would have thought that it would need to act quickly rather than slowly. that is the major difference in purely military terms between what the Russians are able to do in Ukraine and what Israel is faced with in Gaza. And of course, there is another factor at play which I have not discussed, but which has already been commented upon increasingly by various people. Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism has been discussing it in recent articles, which is that this conflict already is having an effect on Israel's economy and Israel's larger society. There are economic strains already beginning to express themselves. There's already warnings from credit rating agencies that they might be considering putting Israel on some kind of negative watch. In other words, Israel might, before long, suffer a credit downgrade. Aspects of the economy, parts of the economy like tourism, are obviously going to take a big hit. But beyond that, I suspect there will be other parts of the economy, the industrial economy, for example, which will be affected also. And the United States, which is drifting inexorably towards a budget crisis of its own, or so it seems to me, might find it increasingly difficult and burdensome to make up the difference. And again, I'm not an expert on the Israeli economy, and I accept that with this conflict with Hamas seen as existential by many people in Israel, it is possible that, in fact likely, that Israel has a high degree of resiliency in the face of these economic pressures. But it's important to say again that Israel is a small country. Its economy is not huge in the nature of things. It does not have the economic depth that, for example, Russia does. Its ability to sustain a long war of the kind that people are talking about seems to me open to question. All of Israel's wars, the ones that have been successful, the ones in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, were short wars. I think I'm right in saying that the longest of those wars was the one in 1948, which is the war that happened when Israel was founded. But of course that took place in a completely different situation and environment. That was a war for the foundation of the State of Israel. And it's not, I think, appropriate to compare the economic situations with that war and the situation that Israel faces, economically speaking, today. But the wars of 1956, 1967, which only lasted 6 days, 1973, which from memory only continued for around 3 weeks, well, they were relatively short wars. And of course, Israel did face a long series of military campaigns in southern Lebanon, starting in 1982. These did have, as I remember, a negative effect on the Israeli economy, but they were not conducted over months at the level of intensity that we are seeing with this present war at the moment. And of course, it's important to say and remember that long war that Israel waged in Lebanon, in the end, was unsuccessful. Israel was obliged to withdraw from Lebanon entirely, and of course it did try to strike back at Hezbollah in 2006, but it was unsuccessful. So, as a relatively small country, Israel does not have, or so it seems to me, the economic resources to sustain a long war. Now, none of this is to say that Israel doesn't have a right to self-defense. I have said previously that Israel does absolutely have a need to secure its position in Gaza. I think that there needs to be a careful re-examination of the intelligence failures and political failures that took place on the eve of the attack on the 7th of October. If it is indeed the case that several Israeli brigades were transferred from Gaza to the West Bank to protect settlers there, and that this was a decision made by the Israeli government and by Prime Minister Netanyahu, well, he needs to answer for that mistake and bear the political consequences of it. And of course, given what happened on the 7th of October, I think there would have been, had Israel taken a political approach at that time, strong support globally for a declaration that Hamas was a terrorist organization. What happened in southern Israel on the 7th of October seems to me to fall well within the definition of terrorism, that it was a terrorist organization, and it might very well have resulted in a general proscription of Hamas, and we would probably not have seen Hamas taking center stage in the way that it is doing now, and it could be that Hamas could have been isolated and eventually broken down in that way. It would not have had the spectacular results that we're seeing now, but perhaps that would have been the more effective approach. I accept, of course, that politically that might have been impossible, and certainly it would have been impossible while Prime Minister Netanyahu remained Israel's Prime Minister. But perhaps it would have been better for Prime Minister Netanyahu at that point to step down, for someone else to take over, for a new government to be formed, for Prime Minister Netanyahu to answer for whatever mistakes he made on the eve of that conflict, and perhaps a better strategy could have been followed in that case. But we are where we are. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. I accept that the situation at the moment is pointing in a completely different direction. But let me repeat again what I have said before. If you're in a hole, stop digging. If a long war isn't going to work in Gaza, and I have to say I at the moment see little prospect of it doing so, and the dangers of a further escalation are huge. If a long war isn't going to work, then it's time for a rethink. And of course, if that rethink again involves replacing Prime Minister Netanyahu with someone else, well, so be it. Better now than wait until the outcome is dictated and the initiative is lost and resolutions start to emerge from the General Assembly, which not only call for a ceasefire, but start to question the authority of the United States to conduct diplomacy in the Middle East, to act as the mediator in the conflict in the Middle East, and which vest that role on the International Peace Conference, which the Chinese have been talking about. And of course, if we ever get to a point where the General Assembly passes a resolution using the Uniting for Peace formula, which is far from impossible, by the way, then that would be a diplomatic and geopolitical disaster, which would affect not just Israel, but the United States as well. As I've said many times, in navigating crises of these sorts, looking ahead, taking realistic decisions, keeping emotion under control, very difficult, I understand, to do, can have better results than acting on one's feelings, letting anger control your decisions, making mistakes, and putting yourself in a worse position than the one in which you might otherwise have been. And again, I've been seeing more reports now, more commentaries from all sorts of people, including several now in the British media, which repeat the point that I have made myself in the past, that those events, those actions that Hamas took on the 7th of October, the taking of hostages, the violence against civilians, all of those things might have been calculated to engineer the crisis that we are in at the moment, to lure Israel precisely into that long war in Gaza. And if that is the plan, that is the Hamas plan, it is firstly, or so it seems to me, a more coherent, more realizable plan than the one that people are talking about Israel having. And it is one which, for the moment, is working. Hamas is resisting Israel in Gaza. The narrative has been shifting away from Hamas and what it did on the 7th of October towards what Israel is doing in Gaza now. There are calls for a ceasefire, which, if they're ever fulfilled, will benefit Hamas, and Israel's position and the position of the United States is coming under challenge across the Middle East. And of course, if there is a wider blow-up, if there is an all-embracing conflict, if all these American military deployments in the Middle East do eventually result in an all-out war between the United States and Iran, well, be under no illusions, that will suit Hamas perfectly. It will be the ideal result that they want to achieve. So, just mentioning all of these things, we will see where this goes. We will see whether Israel and the United States have thought this through, whether their plans really are achievable. What happens if they're not? Do they have the flexibility to change them? And we will also have to see what is going to happen further, given that the General Assembly has now already expressed its voice and is likely to continue to do so over the next few days and weeks. Well, in the meantime, even as we wait tensely on what is going to happen in the Middle East, there has been a flurry of diplomatic activity between the Chinese and the Americans. And it is remarkable and very interesting how all of this has happened entirely behind the radar. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is actually in Washington. He arrived there on the 27th of October. He's had meetings in Washington, whilst in Washington, with President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. He also has had 2 days of talks with US Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And he's had what appears to be a brief meeting with no less a person than President Biden himself. And it's very interesting to read the Chinese readouts of these discussions between Wang Yi and these top US officials, because the readouts are extremely short. They make it very clear that Wang Yi, again, expressed in the strongest terms to Sullivan specifically that China continues to stick to its red lines over Taiwan. That is non-negotiable. But in almost all other respects, these readouts, unusually for Chinese readouts, are generally uninformative. One striking fact about the Chinese readouts is that they don't actually mention at all the current conflict in the Middle East or the conflict in Ukraine. The entire discussion between the Chinese and the Americans, if you believe these readouts, centers on trying to get US-Chinese relations back on some kind of workable track. And it's confirmed that one of the purposes of Wang Yi's visit to Washington was to discuss the possibility and perhaps iron out the problems in advance of a summit meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President Biden in San Francisco in November. The United States is going to have I understand it's a climate summit in San Francisco in November. They've been trying to persuade Xi Jinping to come. He has shown a certain unwillingness, in fact, a very great unwillingness, to confirm that he is coming. The Chinese reacted very negatively indeed to President Biden's insulting language about Xi Jinping, both during his State of the Union address, also in connection with the balloon incident. The Chinese acted very negatively to that. That, for several months, put Chinese-US relations in a complete deep freeze. Xi Jinping skipped the visit, the G20 meeting in Delhi. And as I've said previously, the obvious and clear reason why he did that was not in order to insult his Indian hosts, but in order to avoid having a one-to-one meeting with President Biden. The Chinese have nonetheless now decided that they've clearly made their point that the meeting with Biden can now take place, and it does increasingly look as if Xi Jinping is indeed going to go to Washington, to San Francisco in November, and that he will indeed be meeting Biden there. And I'm going to suggest that two recent moves that we have seen happen in Beijing have some bearing on this matter. Firstly, there was that meeting between Governor Newsom and Xi Jinping, which took place a couple of days ago. We did a program about this, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran. We made the absolutely obvious point that Governor Newsom is clearly manoeuvring to put himself in a position where he might be eligible for the Democratic Party nomination in the event that President Biden is manoeuvred into stepping down. He's conducting, in other words, diplomacy. But of course, it is no coincidence that Newsom is the governor of California, that this summit meeting is supposed to be happening in San Francisco. He will have gone to Beijing to try to persuade on his own behalf and on behalf of California Xi Jinping to come to San Francisco. And of course, he could argue, and no doubt is arguing, that in taking this step, he's acting in line with the administration's policies, and he is playing a constructive role in setting up that summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping, which will be happening next month. And simultaneously with that event, there is the very mysterious and rather enigmatic news that the Chinese Defense Minister, Li Shangfu, who's only been in office for a relatively short time, in fact, just a few months, has suddenly and somewhat inexplicably been sacked. This coming after the equally surprising and unexplained dismissal of the previous Chinese foreign minister, Qian Gu, who has also been sacked. No real explanation as to why that has happened. Now, it's most likely that Li Shangfu's dismissal has domestic reasons. Li Shangfu may have been, probably is, the target of some kind of anti-corruption drive. Xi Jinping takes corruption issues extremely seriously. There's been reports of corruption at within the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the part of the army that deals especially with the strategic missile program and space program. Li Shangfu was closely connected with all of that, and that's almost certainly the main reason for his dismissal. But it kind of escaped notice both in Beijing and Washington that Li Shangfu's dismissal also helps to some extent to clear the air with Washington. He has been the subject of American sanctions because of his long-standing and close relationship with the Russians. And the Chinese have, up to this point, refused military-to-military contacts with the United States until those sanctions on the Chinese Defense Minister, on Li Shangfu, are lifted. Now, Li Shangfu is no longer China's Defense Minister. We're not yet told who's going to be appointed in his place. Presumably that person will not be subject to US sanctions, allowing military contacts to resume. And it is not implausible, by the way, that the new Chinese Defense Minister, whoever that is, will accompany Xi Jinping to San Francisco and will participate in the talks with President Biden. So, there we go. A serious, sustained attempt by the Chinese and the Americans to get the relationship between China and the United States back on track. But it is important to say that this is only an effort to resume some kind of a dialogue. Trust between these two superpowers remains at rock bottom. There is little sign that Chinese foreign policy in any substantive way is changing. The Chinese have made their position on the situation in the Middle East entirely clear. They are supporting the ceasefire calls, and of course they've floated this idea of an international peace conference. And apparently China has declined to participate any further in these attempts that Jake Sullivan is making to bring together various countries to discuss the conflict in Ukraine. There was that meeting some months ago in Copenhagen. Then there was the follow-up talks in Riyadh. Now there's supposed to be more talks happening in Malta. India and South Africa will be participating in these talks, but apparently China has said that it will not participate this time. They participated in previous talks, but they're not prepared to send representatives any further. I personally think that this whole process has never made any real sense and is not really achieving anything, and is just basically background activity. But of course, without China participating, it looks as if that whole process has basically already run its course and is increasingly ceasing to have much purpose. But anyway, that's where we are. So the Chinese not making any concessions. Wang Yi, again, reiterating to Jake Sullivan in the strongest terms China's position on Taiwan. We will see whether or not the United States mollifies its position. The United States is now facing a severe crisis, commitments crisis. It's running out of weapons. It has been running out of weapons to send to Ukraine for quite a long time. It now has the additional burden of finding weapons for Israel, and this when the Israelis themselves now are increasingly talking about a long war and are doing so at US urging. So no sign of any shift on the Chinese position on any geopolitical issues. We will see, however, what these talks in San Francisco achieve, if they achieve anything. I'm going to add, by the way, that I think that one reason why the Chinese decided that it made sense for them to meet the Americans now is because they have managed over the last few months to make an important point. And that point was made when Huawei produced its new smartphone with a Chinese 7nm, if I got that right, super chip. When I was, in former times, I used to remember people talking about the Sputnik moment, the moment in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched into space the world's first artificial satellite. The United States was incredulous when that happened. There was profound shock, and it became clear for the first time that the United States was facing in the Soviet Union a technological superpower, not the backward, primitive country that many people in the United States had supposed that the Soviet Union was, one which managed to had developed nuclear weapons basically through stealing nuclear technology by spying. Anyway, it was, as I said, a major shock, and it created very significant changes in American society post-1956. Huge expansion, for example, in university training and universities, and that was also the case in Europe, and many, many other things. Well, the discovery that China is able to produce advanced super chips like the ones produced in Taiwan and South Korea, which the United States had striven to prevent China making. Anyway, the discovery that that was indeed happening, perhaps it's not a shock comparable to Sputnik, but it still has come as a profound shock for the United States. And of course, it may mean that the Chinese now feel that they can speak to the United States from a strong position. They can come to the Americans and say, look, these attempts that you're making to suffocate our economy, to block our technological developments, they're not succeeding. We've just had a very successful Belt and Road Summit, which hundreds of nations attended. You can't isolate us. You can't obstruct our technological development. So why not draw back on all of that? Why not seek again a modus vivendi with us? Why not lift some of the restrictions on technological goods and trade that you have been imposing upon us, so that we can move forward? I'm going to say straight away that if that is what the Chinese are going to be saying to the Americans in San Francisco and in the current talks in Washington, then I can understand why. But with US officials unofficially and Republican congressmen quite openly talking about China as part of some kind of axis of evil, with Russia and Iran, I think the prospects of any kind of movement forward in trade or technology terms, I don't think that any of that is going to happen. But I can understand why the Chinese might think that it's worth a try, and I can understand also why the Chinese might think that it makes sense for them to try and find friends in the United States, like Governor Newsom, to work perhaps with them more constructively in the future. And I can understand, therefore, why at this time, from what he probably considers to be a strong position, President Xi Jinping has made the decision to go to San Francisco and to meet President Biden there. Anyway, mention of the axis of evil, the new talk about the new axis of evil, takes me to the situation in Ukraine, and firstly to the latest comments by the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson. Now, Mike Johnson has in the past voted against economic financial support for Ukraine. He's been one of the critics, not one of the major critics, but one of the critics for further support for Ukraine. Entirely unsurprisingly to me, he is now changing his tune. Now that he's become Speaker, he has given an interview with Hannity in which he appears to accept that Ukraine is also a victim of aggression, that the aggressor is Russia. Russia is part of the axis of evil alongside China and Iran. That means that the United States can't let Russia win in Ukraine, and that means that Ukraine must be provided with more support. Mike Johnson is saying that the Biden administration's attempt to bundle up aid for Ukraine with aid for Israel and Taiwan, that really doesn't make sense, and that these aid packages need to be dealt with separately. And I suspect that will happen. And I suspect that aid to Ukraine will probably, in the end, be reduced. But I've always felt somewhat cynical about this whole process in Congress. It seems to me that the best way to understand it is as a political battle within the Republican Party between the populist wing, whose effective leader is Donald Trump, and the Mitch McConnell wing, which is the establishment wing. And by getting Johnson elected Speaker, the populist wing has won a point against the Mitch McConnell wing, but we already see how Johnson is now that he is Speaker, is starting to trim his sails and is shifting a little bit back towards Mitch McConnell and his side of the party. He's again talking about the axis of evil. He's taking up these comments of Mitch McConnell's, and he's again speaking about the need to continue to support Ukraine. So we see the shift. Let me say again a point that I have made many times on many programs. The United States will continue to provide financial support to Ukraine. It is likely that the scale of that support will reduce given the budgetary crisis that we see coming over the horizon. But there is always funding, always money in the United States that can be provided for these kind of adventures. There's enormous pressure from within the military-industrial complex, but also from the regime change community, the NGOs, all of those sort of things that are very, very invested in this conflict in Ukraine. there will always be big pressure from them for funding, and some funding will always come. Anybody who supposed otherwise, well, we see that Mike Johnson has already disillusioned them. So, that, I suppose, is some good news for Ukraine, that the extent of the fight, the actual funding that Ukraine is going to get, remains to be seen. In all other respects, to me, it seems to me, the funding is, the situation for Ukraine is becoming increasingly bleak. And there's been another very bleak article about the situation in Ukraine, this time in the London Times, and the author is Michael Clarke, not to be confused, as I have done in the past, with Robert Clarke, completely different people. But Michael Clarke, who is a visiting professor in defence studies at King's College London and a distinguished fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Now, as is often the case with these sort of commentaries, these sort of articles that appear especially in the British media, it strives to find some positive indicators for Ukraine. And we have had also commentaries from the British Defence Ministry. They're saying that the losses, for example, that Russia is suffering in the fighting in Avadiivka may be the highest losses that Russia has suffered over the course of 2023, higher even than the losses that Russia experienced during the fighting in Bakhmut. Now, I don't know what information they have for that. It's undoubtedly the case that the Russians have suffered losses over the course of the fighting in Avadiivka, and they've certainly been higher than the actually very low losses that the Russians have been suffering over the last few weeks, the previous weeks, when, as I've discussed in the past, information from Media Zona, which has been tracking Russian casualties carefully, has established that over the last weeks of Ukraine's offensive, Russian losses fell to almost their lowest level during the entire period of the war. So it could be that Russian losses, in fact, it's highly likely that Russian losses have spiked in connection with the fighting in Avadiivka. Whether they are indeed the heaviest that Russia has suffered this year, I'm going to say frankly, I rather doubt, actually. I think that once again, the Ministry of Defence, the British Ministry of Defence, is placing too much reliance on claims that are coming from Ukraine about the losses that they're inflicting, the Ukrainians are inflicting on the Russians. And of course, the Ministry of Defence says that the Russians are so depleted, so lacking in offensive power, that it is unlikely, indeed, that they lack the strength to carry out a major offensive. Now, Michael Clarke does repeat some of that. He is also talking about Russia being overstretched. He doesn't say anything about this huge manpower build-up that is taking place in Russia at the moment. We hear that recruitment in Russia is now running at the rate of 1,600 men a day. I've never seen anyone in Britain, any publication in Britain mention that fact, or that, according to the Russians, 380,000 men have joined the Russian army, either as volunteers or as full-time professional contract soldiers over the course of this year. I've not seen any mention of that, and I should say that Michael Clark doesn't mention that either. Nor have I seen any real discussion, certainly by the Ministry of Defense, about Russia's military build-up, its equipment build-up. To the extent that Michael Clark discusses that at all, he does say that, he says this: the Kremlin is making major efforts to get Russia's ethnic minorities into uniform and is geared up for a full war economy, but the economy is stalling after a production spike until the second quarter of 2023. Its armaments industries have reached a plateau short of components, workers and skills. Even the biggest producers, such as Uralvagonzavod, the United Aircraft Corporation and the United Engine Corporation, are rumoured to be operating at about 70% of their March 2023 capacity. I don't know where he gets that information from. What are these rumours? How does he know this? And he says they struggle to maintain a 3-shift production cycle. And he goes on to say Russia's probably unable to mount another full strategic offensive in Ukraine until spring 2025 at the earliest, unless Kiev folds before then. But then he does go on to admit, and this is where we come to the heart of the article, that even if Russia can't start, it is facing these problems at the moment in its industries, which, as I said, I've not seen any information that remotely confirms that, certainly not any information coming from the Russian side of things. He does go on to say that also makes the current situation worse than a stalemate for the Ukrainians. This is now a war of attrition of the sort Western powers have not seen since the world wars of the last century. Wars of attrition are ultimately won by the side that can best gear up its industries and apply its productive capacity directly to the battlefield, from high-tech cyber systems down to bullets, boots, and meals ready to eat. The Russians can eventually do this for themselves. And then he says, he goes on to say, Ukrainians can do some of this for themselves and are gearing up for a high-production arms industry in the future. But they can only match Russia in any real war of attrition with Western support, particularly next year, when Russia will be heavily dependent on what it can squeeze from North Korea, Iran, and China. So in effect, what he's basically saying is that the attrition left to itself, Ukraine is going to lose a war of attrition. He appears to believe, and as I said, all based on rumours, not any actual verified fact, that Russian arms production has reached a plateau, but he acknowledges that it's a plateau which Ukraine left by itself can never reach, and of course that the Russians are getting weapons from North Korea, Iran, and he claims China as well, and that makes the pressure on the West even greater. He doesn't talk about the competing pressures upon the United States in supplying weapons to Israel, nor does he acknowledge the fact that the West is already in an armaments crisis, which is limiting its capacity, its ability to continue to supply weapons to Ukraine, irrespective of the competing commitments to Israel. But it's what Michael Clark says about the actual military situation on the battlefields, which is in some ways most interesting. And he says that it's been a good 3 weeks for President Putin in Ukraine. A lot has been happening on the ground, while the eyes of the world have been directed elsewhere. These are tough weeks for Kiev, and Clark then goes on to say, in response to Kiev's summer offensive, Putin ordered Russian forces more than a month ago to launch local counterattacks at multiple points along the 1,000-kilometer line. It's interesting how he assumes that it is Putin who is giving these orders, rather than the Russian military leadership. He then goes on to say that Russia has poured more men and equipment into some ferocious assaults in northeast Donbass towards Kupiansk, in southeast Donbass at Avadiivka, and in Zaporozhye north of Tokmak to halt Ukrainian progress southwards. What's more, last week, Moscow seemed to be digging into the stockpile of missiles it is been conserving. It looks as if Russia's winter offensive air offensive is underway. That, by the way, is not true. They're not yet launching heavy cruise missiles against Ukraine. But anyway, that could indeed be coming. But then Michael Clark discusses the situation in Avdiivka. He says Russia's renewed attack at Avdiivka, which began on the weekend of October 7th, is particularly significant. The Russians have diverted scarce resources. I don't know why he thinks the resources that the Russians have are scarce, but as I said, he hasn't mentioned the 387,000 men that the Russians say that they have recruited over the course of this year. But anyway, he says the Russians have diverted scarce resources yet again to surround the city, bringing in about 6 brigades and a great deal of air power and artillery from other units bombarding the 2 Ukrainian brigades holding the city. I understand that the British Defence Ministry says that the Russians have actually committed 8 brigades to this battle. I will say, again, also, make a point which I've made before, that perhaps the greater part of the force that is currently attacking Avdiivka is drawn from Russia's First Army Corps, which is, of course, originally the Donbass militia, the Donetsk militia, now formally integrated into the Russian armed forces. And then he goes on to say, Michael Clark goes on to say, Ukrainian forces have defended the town fiercely, and the Russians have not completed an encirclement, though they will keep trying. And Avdiivka is becoming another Bakhmut, except that Bakhmut had no real strategic importance. Again, something that I don't agree with. And then he goes on to say this: Avdiivka does have genuine strategic value. It is on a key route into the city of Donetsk, as close to the airport as it is to the northern suburbs of the city. The road system makes Avdiivka the gateway to southern Donbass. The Ukrainians have held it against Russian pressure since last year. It is Kiev's route to victory in that sector. If Ukraine loses Avdiivka now, they will be locked out of the south, and most of what they have achieved in the Donbass further north will count for little. And we're then told about the fact that there's been heavy fighting and that fierce battles have been going on for control of the coke and chemical plants on Avdiivka's north and the sand quarry at the village of Opitnoye. And these miserable industrial sites really matter. And we then go on to read, no wonder Kiev appears deeply worried, according to rumors among security sources in Ukraine. The military commander, Valery Zaluzhny, argues that the Ukrainian offensive is almost over, that they must hold what they have got and prepare for operations next year. But President Zelensky does not agree or will not admit it because of the perception in the West that his war for Ukraine's survival seems to have reached a stalemate. He knows that Western patience is limited for his maximalist demands, that Ukraine must recover all territory invaded by Ukraine since 2014, and Kiev is deeply frustrated not to show much progress in its much vaunted summer offensive. Kiev well understands the political impact in the West of any appearance of stalemate. In truth, the events of the summer are both better and worse than that, but Ukrainian leaders are far from certain that Western politicians or their public will grasp that. And the reason that he thinks that the situation is better for Ukraine than it appears is because of the extremely heavy losses that he assumes the Ukrainians have inflicted upon the Russians. As I said, information from Media Zona, which is the only reliable agency which I know which has been actually tracking real Russian losses, actually simply does not bear that out, and claims that it is worse than people think. It's not difficult, actually, when you drill into what he's saying to understand why, because the situation that he's describing does not actually look like a stalemate. We're not actually looking at any kind of stalemate at all here. He admits that the Russians are working towards the encirclement of Avdiivka. He accepts that the Russians appear to be making progress in places like the slag heap, the coke plant, all of these things. He appears to be accepting that the encirclement of Avdiivka is underway, and he also acknowledges that if Avdiivka is captured by the Russians, there is a real possibility that Ukraine's entire defensive position in southeast Donetsk region will simply collapse. And it is difficult to understand why that might be so, because if Avdiivka falls, it seems to me, looking at a map, I'm not a great map reader, but so it seems to me, that the way is open for the Russians to start advances towards the important town of Pokrovsk to the west, but also it will put the Ukrainian position, make the Ukrainian position in Marinka already under severe stress. It will make it impossible. If Marinka falls, if the Russians finally complete the capture of Marinka, the Ukrainian position in Vuhledar is at serious risk and might collapse. Also, one can see how there could be, at least in theory, a chain reaction in the southern Donetsk region, and no less a person than Michael Clark acknowledges that. And I'm going to say also, looking at a map, at least the way I read maps, which might not be particularly reliable, but looking at a map, if the Russians do gain control of Vuhledar, then I cannot see myself how Ukraine can continue its operations in Zaporozhye. It would put the Russians on Ukraine's eastern flank, the Ukrainian forces that have been launching attacks southward towards Zaporozhye. Vuhledar essentially has been defending, protecting Ukraine's eastern flank. I think that the loss of Vuhledar would collapse any further possibility of any further Ukrainian offensive south towards the Sea of Azov, towards the Black Sea. It would once and for all secure Russia's land bridge to Crimea, and it would be a decisive moment in the war. So if this is correct, and as I said, Michael Clark also seems to think it is, if it is indeed correct that the loss of Avdiivka is that important, then one can understand the sense of operational crisis that now exists in Ukraine. And there's reports coming out that, in fact, there is bitter arguments now between Zelensky and Zelensky. The relationship between these two men has been strained for a very long time. But it seems that they're now arguing once more. Zelensky wants to go over completely onto the defensive. Michael Clark, again, essentially tells us this. Zelensky insists that some kind of offensive operations continue, principally, presumably, in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area, and also across the Dnieper on the eastern bank of Kherson region. In both places, so far as I can see, Ukraine is experiencing very heavy losses of men and machines and achieving nothing of any consequence. But anyway, Zelensky wants to press on with that. And Zelensky instead, perhaps worried about the situation, increasingly anxious about the situation, first and foremost, in Avdiivka, wants to call a stop and wants to redeploy all those forces that are aimlessly defending, or rather attacking, towards Rabotino and Verbovoye and across the river in Kherson region. He wants to redeploy them to try to secure Ukraine's front lines. And I understand that despite events progressing in a very slow and incremental pace further north, there's increasing evidence that the Russians are actually working towards a larger encirclement or envelopment of the Ukrainian forces that are stuck defending places like Kupiansk on the Oskol River, and that as the events in Avdiivka play out, a second, perhaps even more severe operational crisis might begin to happen further north around Kupiansk. And Michael Clark talked about gains, the Ukraine, if Avdiivka falls, seeing all the gains it achieved in northern Donbass come to naught. Those gains were the ones that Ukraine achieved as a result of its Kharkiv offensive last year. Well, certainly, if Avdiivka falls and we see a collapse of Ukrainian positions in the south of Donetsk region, that will doubtless be true. But if there's a second operational crisis for Ukraine in the north, around Kupiansk as well, and the Russians are able to defeat Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk and perhaps surround them there, then, of course, Ukraine's crisis will be much bigger even than Michael Clark is acknowledging. But anyway, there we go. That's where the fighting is. That's where the situation is at the moment. Now, given I've quoted Michael Clark extensively and discussed the claims that the comments that he's making, the extent to which he's talking about an operational crisis, I can't not also mention the fact that he makes claims like this. He says that in 10 days from 10th October, Russia's visually verified vehicle losses in Avdiivka were 109, comprising tanks, fighting vehicles and support units, more than a full brigade's worth. I think he's unaware of the fact that those who follow these things, who be looking at these pictures and photographs, have comprehensively debunked those claims. And he talks about Russian personnel losses running at several hundred a day. But of course, even if that is true, that is also true of Ukraine. And he says that Russians are still operating human wave attacks with their convicts or inexperienced troops. There has never been any point in the war, and I want to repeat this again, when either side has operated human wave attacks, and there is no sign of the Russians doing that in Avdiivka at the moment. But as I said, I've quoted from him extensively. I feel that I should, in fairness, reference that. Last but not least, I also have to say that there have in fact been more actual reports about the situation in Avdiivka from Russian sources. They speak of the Russians actually now having entered the town itself. Apparently there's some visual confirmation of this. It's been caught on camera. This might just have been a reconnaissance group, that they have certainly managed apparently to consolidate control of the slag heap, and that they are indeed closing the ring around Avdiivka. Again, I'm dependent on what others are reporting about in discussing the truth of these things. But overall, the impression I'm getting is actually of a very sophisticated and carefully planned operation in Avdiivka, one which certainly does not use human wave attacks or with convicts and inexperienced troops or anything like that. A much more sophisticated operation than Michael Clark acknowledges, and one which is achieving its objectives, at least for the moment, at a significantly faster rate than I had supposed just a few days ago. So we will see what happens. If Avdiivka does indeed first become encircled and then fall, then it'll be very interesting to see how the British Defence Ministry and others in the West explain that, given what Michael Clark is saying about the consequences of the fall of Avdiivka. But obviously, we're not there yet, and I'm not going to discuss this further until we are. So, an interesting 24 hours, a military operation in Gaza that seems to be pulling its punches at the moment. I think I have to say that. An interesting dialogue restarting between the Americans and the Chinese, and a somewhat cack-handed but nonetheless real acknowledgement in the London Times in the form of this article by Michael Clark that Ukraine is now facing a very severe operational crisis. Indeed, in Avdiivka, with dissension at the highest level of Ukraine's leadership between Zelensky and Zelensky about what to do, and very grave consequences for Ukraine if Avdiivka is lost. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. All that remains is for me to remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, Telegram, and of course now X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't also forget to check out our shop and see the amazing things that you will find there: mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember, tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.